Next up is Dr. Dirk Strydom talking about the expansion of soybean production and consumption.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the privilege to come and present a few factors in this regard to you. Thank you very much, David, for the introduction, and Ferdi for laying the foundation in terms of the outlook. I think we're going to zoom in a few aspects a bit closer, as explained by Ferdi. So on the agenda, talking about South African production and consumption, what happened, some yield comparisons, looking at what the plans is going forward, the futures of soybeans, the possibility of production expansion, looking at some feed consumption, supply and demand economics, and then a close of what will be the focus areas going forward for this industry. So starting off, if we look at the production, this is really one of the success stories within agriculture in South Africa. We were at some point of stage, we've seen the advantages that something like rotation systems have, and we've seen the advantages that soybeans have in the rest of the world. And in South Africa, we had the big discussions about how we're going to get this production running in the local market. And there was a lot of questions. Is it first the production, or is it first the processing that needs to be set up? And it's a wonderful story where the industry came together and we built the industry up where we had more than 100% growth in this case. So if you look at the graph, you'll see that the blue line is the increase in the hectares. Now this is a wide time frame. You can see from the 1970s up here to the 2000s, 2006, it was quite a more or less a straight line. And from there on, with the increase in the processing side, we've seen this big expansion in terms of our hectares. But together with that, in any agriculture system, you also need to have this efficiency in improving in terms of yields as well. We know that the margins are getting smaller, and to manage that margins, you need this increase in yields to facilitate that process. And that you can also see in terms of the graph, in terms of the shaded areas, the tons per hectares, and you could see a bit of a trend going forward, a bit of a trend in increase, but we need a drastic type of movement upwards in order to keep the sustainability of this industry. So if you compare all of this, the hectares, the tons per hectares, we've increased quite significantly the supply within South Africa, which was also complemented in terms of the processing within the country. If you look at the soybean consumption side, if we look at the processing figures, what I just explained, the blue line, you can see the vast trend of an increase in terms of it, getting value out of the local produce, creating value for the uptake markets into the value chain, which is a very important factor these days within agriculture. You need this value chains to pull through the system and to pull the production side. You could see also in terms of the animal feed side, animal feed increasing, making sure that progress is there as well. I think the one that I want to keep in mind as for today is the human consumption side. And with the human consumption side, we see a more straight line type of trend, not necessarily an increased trend. And that's a big focus that's going to be in the future. And I think with new technologies that will be explained later today as well, is to showcase what this industry can do going forward as well. If we look a bit in terms of what we talked about, what Ferdi mentioned as well, in terms of imports of oil cake and some of the challenges we have there, you could see that as we progressed in terms of the production, as we progressed in terms of processing technology, we're also seeing that the percentage of local increase also increased in terms of it, local consumption of soybean oil cake. And you can see that we these days close to a level of 70% self-sufficiency, and if we work hard together as an industry, if we get this anomalies in terms of infrastructure and logistics, if we can correct that, we can easily move to a self-sufficiency state. The next one that I'm going to stand a bit still is in terms of yield comparisons. Now I've put in a maize yield graph here for you, and that's with compliments from BFAP. Thank you very much, Prof. Meyer, in terms of your team doing all this work. So it's a bit of a comparison in terms of what's happening with maize trends all over in the world. And you could see that in South Africa, we like to call ourselves maize producers, and we know how to plant maize in the conditions we have as well. We don't necessarily have the same natural resources as the rest of the world, and in terms, specifically in terms of rain and moisture content. And here you can see the South African farmers really on par with the rest of the world, doing well, getting new technology into South Africa, utilizing new technology, and making sure that we get the most out of that plant in terms of the resources we have. So if we do that comparisons, you can see we right up there in terms of the percentage growth of yields with the rest of the world, and that makes us that we can start to compete with the rest of the world. Now, the next thing is, if we talk soybeans, that we manage, like Prof. Meyer indicated, our yields are lower than the rest of the world, but we managed to have a bit of growth in it, but not yet sufficient enough to make sure that we're sustainable into the future. And that's why there's a lot of new initiatives to try and get the yield increase, and to make sure that we sustain that yield increase on a constant basis, and that we don't reach a platform. And I think the biggest one that a lot of people forget is, it's not just about the yield increase, it's also about the consistency in terms of yield. So if you look at the graphs, if you look at the South African line, which is the grey line, you can see 1 year we'll do a proper good yield, and the next year we'll have a substantial decrease in terms of yield, and that's based on climatic conditions. So we need that adaptation in terms of cultivars, we need that adaptation in terms of new technology, assisting us in getting a consistent yield. A producer likes to plant something where he knows more or less what his yield's going to be, and where his risk is limiting in terms of it. And if you look at agriculture in South Africa, it's all about managing the risks. It's all about managing the risk through the system because of the tight margins that we're looking at. So here the focus is definitely in terms of getting yields up, but together with that, making sure that yields are consistent and providing that risk limiting factor in that regard. So what's the initiatives that we're talking about? What's the stuff we're looking at? We know soybeans is an open pollinated crop, which means that farmers can have hold back seed, where they can hold the seed back and clean it and plant it into the next season. And the result of that is it helps a bit in terms of the producer side, in terms of finances, but on the downside is you get less investment from seed industry into this market, because of the low return on investment. And we had an industry sit together and say, how do we correct this? How do we make sure we get new technology in? How do we fast track cultivar development, and making sure we get to that goals of increases yields and the consistency of yields? So what the industry did is they developed a non-profit company called SACTA, South African Cultivar and Technology Agency, and here the purpose is to collect a levy at the end of the value, or at the end of delivery where it's delivered, and then that levy, that funding is distributed according to the market share of the seed companies. Now the purpose of that levy is to facilitate research and development, and to fast track that innovation state. So it's an incubator to give that extra additional incentives in order to develop more and to make sure that we get the latest technology in South Africa. And then the Protein Research Foundation, together with a lot of role players in the industry, doing also a lot of work on agronomical practices, cultivar selection, cultivar trials, disease research you've heard previously, trying to see how we can better this system and grow better and make it easier to grow soybeans going forward as well. So this is just some of the initiatives, 2 of them that I want to highlight, and we've already seen some results in terms of it, specifically in terms of the SACTA that was recently established in the market and is still fairly young. So what's that results that I'm talking of? This slide is in Afrikaans, but it is recently one of the seed companies brought in new technology into the country called Intacta, and that is a real milestone for us in South Africa. It's the first time in 20 years that we got new technology into the country. And the prospects and the trials we've seen, the results they indicated to us, looks really promising, not just in terms of the yields, but assisting in terms of better practices, better disease management, better insect management in that regard. So it's really helping us to make sure that we get to that levels that we've put up in terms of objectives. So the next thing that I want to talk about a bit is what's the future? What does the future look like? What is the future of soybeans? The first part that I'm going to stand a little bit still to is the production. So the colleagues, Prof. Blichnout made an excellent study in looking at all the different factors, determining where in South Africa can we plant soybeans successfully, and this is a bit of a graph explaining it. So the green circle is where we predominantly would plant soybeans, and then we've got two additional red ones where we see the possible expansion is. So in the northwestern Free State side, Northwest Province, we've already seen substantial increases over there, still some space in terms of expansion there. And then, like Dr. Prof. Meyer indicated previously as well, the Eastern Cape's got some space as well to produce more in terms of that area. Now, the next thing linked to that is if we look at the whole production, we all know production is not just about the crops, but it's also about the economics of the crops. And if you look currently in terms of the whole oilseed basket, the oilseeds is comparing very well in terms of the rest of the crops. And this is recent figures. This is basically for this new planting season that we did projections. I must say, it's these days very difficult to really do a proper input cost calculation. The volatility in input costs due to COVID and a lot of different reasons is really at a high level. So it's difficult to calculate the input costs, but this gives us already a fair idea. And if you look at that, and given the risk of input cost increases, we can see that the soybean market is definitely a consideration. And if you look at moisture in the soils currently, it makes sense to plant soybeans. And the word that we get, the farmers are really preparing this season to look at, again, at very high levels of planting in terms of soybeans. So that just gives you a bit of an idea how it compares to the rest of the crops, and what is the possibilities of expansion given just that part of the economics. The next one is if we look at the consumption side, and if we talk animal feed projections, we do animal feed projections for the Protein Research Foundation to look at where we can end up, what can be possibilities going into the future. And you can see there is feed increases, but what we also see is that the big driver within the feed industry is to make sure the feed conversion ratios is kept as low as possible. And we've seen in produce like broilers, those type of feed consumers, that this efficiency rates are increasing constantly, and the producers in that regard is making sure that they get the most out of feed. The next thing is then the population increase. The population increase will also be a driver for that, and what we see in terms of that is that those two are equalizing each other out. So the next thing is, where do we get more feed from? And the feed increases will predominantly come from looking at export markets, where we start to export animal products in terms of your likes of looking at chicken with the master plan everyone's talking about, looking at beef products, pork products, those type of things that will give us that additional feed side. So if you look at the bottom table, if we skip forward and we go into the future for 2029, the expectations is that the total soya oil cake requirements would be in order of 1.4 million tons. That, if you convert it, gives us a local soya requirement of 1.7 million tons. That is just for oil cake. It's excluding the full fat side. So if you bring in the full fat side, we're talking more or less about 2 million tons. If we get the infrastructure correct, we can get the transport correct, then we can easily be at the self-sufficiency levels. And that means that we can be 100% self-sufficient in South Africa. But it is linked to a bit of a few things in the infrastructure side that must happen. Now I want you to remember a bit that figures of a 2 million. And if we look at the current season, this season we made big strides in terms of production, and we're already close to that levels of 2 million. This is the NAMC supply and demand estimates that I publish, and there you could see at the bottom on line 21, they're expecting already at the end of this season a ending stock of 350,000 tons. So that means we already have a carryover stock that we're going into the season. Still within line in terms of a pipeline phase. The market is not too uncomfortable with it. It's a bit on the high side. But if we go and we fast forward a bit in terms of what Prof. Meyer indicated, is that there's big possibilities in terms of further production expansion. We've already talked about the yield increases to make sure that the sustainability is running. And then the question is, if we have all this and we have this expansion, what will happen going forward? What will happen in terms of making sure that we get that equilibrium in the system that gives the sufficient prices to be sustainable going forward as well? So like within the maize industry, we are a net exporter. So exporting is a huge factor for us, where we need to have that release holes where we can quickly export, and then we have an equilibrium again, and then the markets can give indication again for producers to plant the amount of hectares and to keep the stability in terms of planting as well. So what I'm talking about there is, if we look at this, let's say we're increasing this hectares, we're increasing the production side, then we need to look at a few release holes in the system. So one that I've already started to talk about and explain is the animal feed industry. So with the animal feed industry, given the population growths and the technical growths in terms of feed conversion ratios, we're going to be very reliant in terms of exports of animal products. And the moment we export that animal product, it means it's processed or produced within the local market. When it's produced within the local market, it means it's the utilization of local feed, and that's typically what you want in an economy, is to make sure that we grow the local part. The second thing that we're looking at is also exports. Prof. Meyer indicated already in terms of what happened to our neighbors, our continent neighbors. You could see that their increase in production increased together with South Africa. That was traditionally our export markets as well. So that means that market starts to get limited as well. So what we need now is we need to look now in terms of what we call deep sea exports, getting different markets to give us this release holes. Traditionally, we're not exporters. There is years that we did substantial exports, but not that big to give this big release hole. So a lot of work going into now finding markets, making sure that there's markets that can take up this large supply of us. And then the last one, which I think is very important for today, is the human consumption side. The human consumption side is still playing a very small role, and if we can increase this side, there is a lot of opportunities within the market as well. And there's a lot of opportunities to utilize this increase in production. So for the future, it's all about production needs to increase. We need to get that yields up to make sure that the sustainability is up and running and that we keep up with the price cost squeeze happening. But the second part of it is that we need to have that parts that's creating the release holes in terms of making sure that we get quickly into an equilibrium phase as well. So what is the important variables that we looked at going forward, and what is needed to go forward? Economics of soybean production is one of the biggest parts that we need to look at. If we talk going to export parity levels, that is going to happen the moment we increase production side. That means the prices are at a lower base, and in order to be sustainable and to be still in a place where it is profitable to plant these soybeans, you need to increase the yields. And that's the basic economic principles, and making sure that that lower yield side or that lower price side must be substituted with a higher production side. And then given that is, you need that constant export sides that helping you either in animal products or in the physical bean that you can export. The next side is increasing in terms of local consumption. We've seen that work very well with production. The moment the consumption increases, the production automatically follows that as well. And there we've mentioned it numerous times now, logistics to coastal areas playing a very large role and can have a big release side in terms of the supply and demand. We're talking about consistencies, not just consistencies in yield, but also consistencies in terms of quality, soybean quality, process quality. So there's still a lot of work in that regards to ensure that for the uptakers of the soybeans, and then like I mentioned, the exports of animal products such as beef, poultry and pork, that's playing a large role in terms of the consumption of the feed side. And in this regard, as we are now standing, the master plans that everyone's talking about, the AAMPs, is playing a large role in facilitating this, making sure we set ourselves up as a local industry to get to these variables going forward. And then the last one I want to highlight is, for us as producers, human consumption is very important, and human consumption we see as a large space that can have also a big increase side, and that can utilize this production. So from a producer side, we want the innovative people out there to create all this human type of foods and to get that into the market. And by doing that is you're going to actually assist the producer as well. And then obviously the last one to give us that quick release holes is the export market, specifically deep sea exports, to help us to get quick equilibriums and to stabilize the market in the future. And with that, it's a short oversight of what we expect in terms of what's going to happen with production and consumption. Thank you very much.